Okay, so we're going to try to do two simanim today, ayin test and pay. I was getting a little bit nervous when we started the first couple simanim in Hilchas Chametz. It seemed to be to me much more difficult than what we saw in Hilchas Kriyas Shema. So pleasantly, these two simanim in Shagged, besides being short, they're very fundamental and straightforward, I think. So we'll get going and see if we could get both of them in. So the first shir is titled Chametz Shekibul Avachrayis, the Chametz of the guy that you took responsibility for, and you made its takana on the 14th day of Pesach after the Zman Isser, and then after Pesach you'll eat that Chametz. Sounds like a very complicated case, but we're going to see step by step is actually very straightforward, the Chiddush that he wants to say. So the first thing we'll see, first we'll discuss the din of Chametz Shavuot and Pesach, and we're going to discuss the din of Chametz before Pesach, then we'll discuss the Shaila that the Shagged wants to deal with. So we have a lot of the very basic Yesodos of the Hilchos of Chametz in these Shirim. So the first thing we'll see inside is the Gemara in Pesachim, Daf Chav Ches Amud Aleph, starting with the Mishnah. Chametz shel nachri sha'avar alav Pesach mutar b'hana. The chametz of a guy that went through Pesach, you're allowed to get benefit from it after Pesach. V'shel Yisrael asur b'hana. But the chametz of Yisrael is going to be asur. Shneimar, as the pasuk says, lo yireh chasa'or. You can't see chametz during the 7 days of Pesach. Right, so that line, because of the pasuk lo yireh chasa'or, is a little bit not clear. After we get through seeing the Gemara, it will become clear, right? Because that's a pasuk about on Pesach itself. It doesn't teach me anything about what happens with the chametz after Pesach. So the Gemara asks, Mani Mas Nisan, who's the opinion of the Mishnah? Lo Rabbi Yehuda, v'lo Rabbi Shimon, v'lo Rabbi Yosef Glili. It's not any of these three Tanoim, and we're going to explain what these Tanoim hold, and then we're going to see how the Mishnah fits in. Maihi, so what are these opinions that we're quoting? Tanya, the Brisa says, Chametz, bein lifnei zmano, bein la'achar zmano, over love, bilav. Chametz, both before the time and after the time. That means both on Erev Pesach, after Chatzos, and after Pesach is over, there's an Isser Lav on that Chametz. Toch zmano, if a person would eat the Chametz on Pesach itself, that's what Toch Zmano here means, over a lav, b'lav, v'kari. So then it's a lav and kari, stiv Rabbi Yehuda. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Now, according to Rabbi Yehuda, all chametz is asur both before and after Pesach. Before means from chatzos, Erev Pesach, and then whatever chametz was in existence on Pesach remains asur forever. And it doesn't make a difference whether it was a guy's chametz or a Jew's chametz. There was chametz, it becomes asur on Pesach and it remains asur forever. You have to make new chametz after Pesach. Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Chametz lifnei zmano ula achar zmano eino over love v'lo klum. Chametz before the time and after the time, there's no isser. Okay, so there's no isser after 6 hours on Erev Pesach, and there's no isser after Pesach is over. Toch zmano over love v'karis v'lav. Only on Pesach itself is there a karis and a lav. Anytime that you can't eat the chametz, it's also asr and hana, and that's going with the sheet of the Tanakama. It means Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon also holds that. Maybe the Tanakama here means referring to both of those two shitas. That according to Rabbi Yehuda, not only is asr to eat chametz from 6 hours Erev Pesach until forever, as long as that chametz was around during Pesach, it's also going to be asr and hana. Same thing according to Rabbi Shimon. His isser is only on Pesach itself. On Pesach itself is asr and hana. Rabbi Yosef Glili Omer, and Rabbi Yosef Glili says, Tamal atzmecha heyach chametz asr b'hana kol shiva. I'm wondering on you, how is it possible that chametz is asr and hana even all 7 days of Pesach? Rabbi Yosef Glili, his opinion is that there's no isser hana on chametz. You're just not allowed to eat it, but you're allowed to get benefit from it. That's Rabbi Yosef Glili's shita. So now, how does our Mishnah fit into these shitas? Because the Mishnah said, after Pesach, the chametz of a goy is mutter, and of a yid is aser. We didn't have any shita in the Tanaim that made any distinction between whether the chametz belonged to a Jew or to a non-Jew. So the Gemara continues. We're going to skip down to where we've copied from later on in the Gemara. Rava Amar, Rava says, La'olam Rabbi Shimon he. Really, our Mishnah is opinion Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon kenasa kanis. Rabbi Shimon makes a knas. Since you were over the Isser of Bal Yira Bal Yimotzi on Pesach, so then Chazal said that you cannot use that chametz ever. That's only the chametz that you were over the Isser of Bal Yira and Bal Yimotzi on Pesach, which is the chametz of the Yid. Then when it comes after Pesach, there's a knas d'Rabbanan. And that, by the way, also explains the lashon that we saw in the Mishnah, that it's Asr and Hana because of Lo Yireh Lecha Sa'ar. Because he was over that Isser on Pesach, that's why there's a Kanas d'Rabbanan that you can't use that chametz after Pesach. And then, skipping further on into the Gemara, this is actually a snip of the Gemara from Lamed Amud Aleph, that Damar Rava says, Ki avinam be Rav Nachman, we were in the base measure of Nachman, Ki avinafki shiva yomi de Pischa, as soon as the 7 days of Pesach were over, Amarlan, he would tell us, Poku uzavinu chamira de bnei chela. You could go buy chametz from the goyim, because the chametz of the goyim there was no bal yira bal yimatzeh. No one did any isser with it, and therefore immediately after Pesach you could buy chametz from a goyim, and that would be like the opinion of Rabbi Shimon. So what we see is that when it comes to chametz she'avar lava Pesach, chametz after Pesach, the psak halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, that on a D'Oraisa level, there's no problem with any chametz after Pesach, but on a D'Rabbanan level, we have a kenas that any chametz that there was an Isser done with it, you can't use that chametz after Pesach. That's really all we need to know to answer the shaila of the Shagas Aryeh, but before we get to that, he goes and explains to us what is the halacha before Pesach, from 6 hours Erev Pesach and on. So some opinions hold, this is the opinion of the Baal Amor, he says that if the halacha is like Rabbi Shimon, like we just said, so then that would mean before Pesach, there's no Isser Hana at all. The Isser Hana only starts with the beginning of Yontif, right? Not like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, but we don't hold like Rabbi Yehuda. That's the opinion of the Baal Hamor. However, most poskim explain that even on Erev Pesach, there is an Isser, and that would seem to be like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And they're going to maintain that the two opinions are not connected to one another. Right? There's one discussion of what's the din of chametz before Pesach, and there's a separate discussion of what's the din of chametz after Pesach. It happens to be that Rabbi Yehuda is machmer by both of them, and it happens to be that Rabbi Shimon is mekel by both of them, but it doesn't mean that we have to paskin the same in both cases. And the Shagas Aryeh brings 3 proofs that the Gemara holds like Rabbi Yehuda before Pesach, that the chametz is already Asr and Hana from Erev Pesach, from 6 hours and on. And he's going to bring 1 Stam Mishnah and 2 Stam Gemaras, right, that have this idea. And they're all based on the same concept, which is built off one of the previous shurim. So the first proof is the Gemara Pesachim Daf Mem Tes Amud Aleph, second Maramakom on the sheet. Mishnah Haholech Lishchot Es Pischo V'Lomos Beno V'Lechol Sudas Ersin V'Beis Chamav. A person is on his way to Shechus Korban Pesach, or to do a bris, or to do Sudas Ersin in his father-in-law's house. V'Nizkar Sheish Lo Chametz B'Soch Beso, and he remembers he has chametz in his house. Im Yachal Lachzul Levar V'Lachzul V'Tzpaso. If he could go back home, get rid of the chametz, and then be able to return to his mitzvah, Yachzu Yivar, so that's what he should do. V'Im Lav, if he doesn't have time for that, Mivatlu Belibo, he's just as bittul. He just as bittul, and that saves him from the isser of having chametz. But if he's doing something which is urgent, like to save someone from the goyim, or from a river, or from robbers, or from a fire, or from a collapsing building, Yavato Belibo, then he just is mivatal. So we see over here that he's going to check his Korban Pesach. That would be a issue for him to have chametz when he's shechting the Karban Pesach. So he wants to be mevatel it in order to take care of that issue. I mean, there's generally going to be the issue of when Pesach comes, he's going to have this chametz, but it's clear that we're also talking about a case of a person that's shechting his Karban Pesach. That was one of the cases. So bittul takes care of his problem. Now, we explained in the first shir on Hilchos Chametz that, based on the Ran, that the way bittul works only in a very specific situation, because it's like a hefker, but it's not a full hefker, if you remember. We discussed that. And therefore, it only works to do bittul before it becomes aser, and then it'll work when it's aser and hana. If it's mutter and hana, so then you have to do a regular hefker. A bittul is not going to work, because a bittul is only a quasi-hefker, which only works because it's anyway not really your chametz. So we explained it only works, you have to do it before it becomes aser and hana, and then it'll work for when it becomes aser and hana. But it's not going to work for a time period when it's mutter and hana, which generally, when we think about that, we don't need it to work at a time when it's mutter and hana, because if it's mutter and hana, so then you're allowed to have it. But the Shagat points out that's not so according to Rabbi Shimon. Someone who's shechting his Karban Pesach is not allowed to have chametz, but it's not yet aser and hana. Because we explained, according to Rabbi Shimon, chametz only becomes aser and hana when Yontif begins. Shechting the Karban Pesach is before that. So therefore, according to Rabbi Shimon, bittul is not going to solve this person's problem. He's going to shecht his Karban Pesach, he has chametz in his house. Bittul is only going to kick in when Yontif starts, because that's when the chametz becomes aser and hana. When he's shechting his Karban Pesach, his bittul didn't do anything yet. So how does this help him if he's shechting his Karban Pesach and he has chametz in his house? Explains the Shagat, that's because this mission is not like the sheet of Rabbi Shimon. It's clear that this mission is like the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda, that the chametz already becomes aser and hana from chatzos erev Pesach, and therefore the bittul will work for that time period. And when he comes to shech his Karban Pesach after chatzos, the chametz will already be taken care of because the bittul already kicks in. So therefore, we have one stam mishnah that's like the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, and the Gemara doesn't comment on it that this mishnah is not lahalacha or anything like that. The second source that we see that the Gemara seems to hold like the sheet of Rabbi Yehuda is Os Gimel. I made a mistake here on the Maramakomos. I went back to Aleph. But really, the third Maramakom, which is supposed to be Os Gimel, which is the Gemara Pesachim Daf Dalid, Amud Aleph, says as follows. And it's trying to explain why is it that we trust ketanim, children and women, on bedikas chametz if it's a chazaka that there was of an isser, right? We have a chazaka, there's a chiyuv that it requires bedika, and you only have this one aid, which is a apostle aid, it's only a katan or an isha, so how can we rely on them to say that they did a proper bedika? So the Gemara explains, we're talking about a case where there was a chazaka that it was not checked at a certain point, the ka'amri hani, and then these people told us, but kine, we checked it. Ma'udatema, I would have thought, Lula Hamninu, we can't believe them. Lo Nunu Rabbanon, Chazal cannot believe them. Kamashwan, so the Chiddush is, Kev on the B'dikas Chametz Midrabanan, who, since checking for Chametz is only a Derabanan, Demida Raisa b'Bittul Ba'al Masagi, because on a Diraisa level it's enough to do Bittul, Masagi lay, it's good enough for it. So him Nu Rabbanan, Bidarabanan. So Chazal decided we can rely on them because we're only discussing Issa Derabanan. Now, Bittul, as we explained, according to Rabbi Shimon, isn't going to work until Yontif. According to Rabbi Yehuda, it works right away, from the beginning of the time you have to get rid of your chametz. Now, there's a diraisa chiyuv, you have to get rid of your chametz erev Pesach because of the pasuk of Tashbisu, which we spoke about last week. The pasuk of Tashbisu, so Armi Batechem, which is Yom Rishon, we explain Yom Rishon is erev Pesach. So you have a chiyuv diraisa to get rid of your chametz erev Pesach, even according to Rabbi Shimon. It just doesn't come aser and hana until nightfall. So therefore, if I have a house that requires bedika, according to Rabbi Shimon, I have to get rid of the chametz. Doing bittul will not help, because it's not yet aser and hana until nightfall. Right? Very similar to the first raya, but just from a different source. And the third, which is again a very similar proof, just from a different source, is the fourth Maramakom, which again mislabeled as Aleph again. The fourth Maramakom is Shnei Tziburim, and Pesachim Daf Tesam Beis Shnei Tziburim Echad shel matzah v'echad shel chametz. If a person has two piles, one pile is matzah and one pile is chametz, this is outside. V'lifneim shnei batim, and you have two houses in front of these two piles. Echad baduk v'echad she'eino baduk. One was checked already for chametz, one was not yet checked for chametz. V'asu shnei achbarim, and two mice come. Echad shachal matzah v'echad shachal chametz. And you saw one took from the matzah pile, one took from the chametz pile. V'liyadin hayla hay ayel v'hayla hay ayel. And we don't know which house the mice went into. Hainu shnei kubos. So that scenario is very similar to the halacha that we say about two baskets. And what's the halacha of two baskets? It's not in the Mishnah says. Shnei kubos, we have two baskets. Achas shel chulin, v'achas shel truma. One basket has chulin, one basket has truma. V'lifneim shnei san, and there's two bushels in front of these baskets. Achas shel chulin, v'achas shel truma. One of them is chulin and one of them is truma. V'nafel elu toch elu, and these two baskets fall into the two bushels. Mutarin. So both of them are mutter, or the one that wasn't truma we assume is mutter and as chulin. Shani omer, because I'm going to say chulin l'toch chulin naflu. We could assume that the chulin went to the chulin. U'truma l'toch truma naflu, and the truma went into the truma. Now, there's no scientific reason to assume that the chulin went to the chulin and the truma went to the truma. There's no any magnetism over here. But since, as we're going to see, it's only an isser d'Rabbanan, so basically it's a suffix d'Rabbanan, where we have the ability to say, if it happened in this particular way, then I'm okay. So since it's only an isser d'Rabbanan and it's only a suffix, so we're mekel. So the same thing would apply by these two houses, one which already had a bedika done on it, so we want to do another, to require him to do another bedika, because of the suffix, we won't require him to do so. And the Gemara says, Amor darmin and shani omer b'truma d'Rabbanan. Maybe I'll only say this type of svara by truma, which is d'Rabbanan. If we're talking about a case where the truma is d'Rabbanan, which has to be in that particular Mishnah. But chametz d'Oraisa mi'amrinan. But will we say this about chametz d'Oraisa? And the Gemara answers, Ata b'dikas chametz d'Oraisa. You think b'dikas chametz is d'Oraisa? D'Rabbanan he. Checking for chametz is only d'Rabbanan. To be d'Oraisa bittul ba'amasagile, because d'Oraisa it's enough just to do bittul. So again, it's exactly the same phrase that we saw in the previous Marmakom. And again, this type of svara, the Shagat pointed out, only works within the shita of Rabbi Yehuda, because according to Rabbi Yehuda, bittul always kicks in immediately when you start having any issues of chametz. According to Rabbi Shimon, the bittul is only going to work when Yontif starts, because that's when you have the Isser Hana. And therefore it's not going to take care of your chiyuvei d'Oraisa from before that. So we have these three proofs that the Gemara and the Mishnayos seem to understand automatically, that we hold like the Shita Rabbi Yehuda of the Isser Chametz before Pesach. However, Shagat points out we could possibly answer these three rayas and say that it's not necessarily only according to the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. It could be also according to the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, because, and this it seems like we don't know for sure that it's true, but perhaps we could say that just like Rabbi Shimon has an Isser d'Rabbanan after Pesach, perhaps Rabbi Shimon also agrees that there's an Isser d'Rabbanan before Pesach. Right, so on a d'Oraisa level, it's true. There's a machlokas between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon. The Rabbi Yehuda holds an Isser d'Rabbanan, Rabbi Shimon holds that it's mutter. But d'Rabbanan, there's no difference. Rabbi Shimon holds l'maisa, the chametz is already aser and hana midrabanan erev Pesach. And if so, it could be bittul could possibly work for that type of chametz, because l'maisa I can't get benefit from it, even though it's only d'Rabbanan. And since l'maisa I can't get benefit from it, therefore I don't need a full hefker, it would suffice for me to do a bittul. And that way we'd be able to answer up these three proofs. However, it points out though, there's still proofs against the sheet of the Baal Amor, because the Baal Amor seems to understand that there is no Isser Hana Erev Pesach, even midrabanan. The other shitas that are machmir, maybe they hold Rabbanan, maybe they hold D'Oraisa. You have to look at the wording to see if they're specifically passing like Rabbi Yehuda, or they're just saying that there's an Isser Erev Pesach. And it seems like from the Rif, he's just saying there's an Isser Erev Pesach. It's not clear D'Oraisa or Rabbanan. Could be, maybe he holds like Rabbi Shimon, but we see from these three Gemaras at least that there for sure is some sort of Isser on a La Halacha. Right? Maybe Rabbi Yehuda D'Oraisa, maybe Shimon D'Rabbanan, but there definitely is some sort of Isser, but it wouldn't be necessarily only according to the Shita of Rabbi Yehuda. So now we're going to get to the question of the Shagas Aryeh that he wants to answer in this tshuva, and the shaila is as follows. It's a little bit complicated, but we'll see it's actually very basic. The question is, I have chametz of a guy that I took responsibility for. So therefore there's an Isser, and as we explained also in the previous siman, there's also a chiyuv for me to get rid of it, Erev Pesach. Right? Just like the same chiyuv that there is by the chametz of a yid. By the chametz of a guy, I'm allowed to not destroy it, I just have to make sure it's not considered in my rishus. And the two ways halachically I can do that is by making a mechitza, 10 tefachim in front of it, or by designating a special place that, like that place belongs to the guy during Pesach, and then I put the chametz there. So if I do either of those two things, so then I'm not over the Isser. So we're going to talk about a case where he didn't do that when he was supposed to do that, which is Erev Pesach before Chatzos. He did it Erev Pesach after Chatzos. So the question is that chametz after Pesach going to be mutter in Hana for a yid if he wants to eat it? Now the truth is this question really is not directed specifically at this type of chametz. It's just that we don't really find such a possibility. We don't find a heichetimsa. We don't find a situation where I could have already been entered into the Zman Isser and then still have that chametz after Pesach, and I wasn't over the Isser during Pesach. Right? For example, say I have chametz of a yid, and it's already after 6 hours, and I still have it. So the only thing I could do to make sure that I'm not over the Isser from now on is to burn it. That's the only thing I could do, because as we explained, it's already usser at this point, so therefore there's no bittul, is not going to work on it. My only option is to destroy it. If it's destroyed, so there's nothing to talk about of what I can do with it after Pesach, because it's not around. Practically, I can only talk about a type of chametz that was over the Isser Erev Pesach, but not on Pesach itself, and it's still around after Pesach, is this case of the chametz of a gun. It's just a technicality why we're talking about this type of chametz. But the svara behind the question is that the mitzvah of tashbisu applies Erev Pesach, and he was over that Isser, right? The Isser of, he had a mitzvah to destroy the chametz, and he didn't do it. The Isser of Bal Yirah Bal Yamatzeh, that applies on Pesach itself, and that Isser he was not over, because he already fixed up his issue before Pesach started. So the question is there a kanas, because we hold like Rabbi Shimon, right? After Pesach it's only Asr if there was a kanas. Is it shaykh a kanas in a situation where he was over the Isser of Tashbisu, but he wasn't over the Isser of Bal Yirah Bal Yamatzeh? That's the question. And the answer, very simple. He brings from the Lashon of the Gemara. The Lashon of the Gemara was that we saw in the first Maramakom, or in that second section, that Rabbi Shimon kanasa kanis, hol v'avar alei b'val yirah b'al yamatzeh. The reason for the kanas is because he was over this or b'al yirah b'al yamatzeh. Therefore, if he was only over this or tashbisu, but by the time Pesach came around, he took care of the chametz by making the wall or putting it in a separate place, and therefore he wasn't over this or b'al yirah b'al yamatzeh, so there's no kanas. Right, we're not going to make up our own kanas. It says in the Gemara the kanas is for this or b'al yirah b'al yamatzeh. So if he wasn't over this or b'al yirah b'al yamatzeh, so then there's no kanas and he can eat that chametz. That's simin ayin tes. Right, we basically just discussed the isser of chametz after Pesach, the isser of chametz before Pesach, and that the isser of chametz after Pesach is based on kanas only for someone who's over this or b'al yirah b'al yamatzeh. That sums that up. Now in Siman Pei, he's speaking about a very similar situation, but it's really going to, springboard us into a completely different discussion. And it's talking about where he has the chametz of the guy, and he didn't set up the wall Erev Pesach, and he was actually waited until Pesach itself, in the middle of Pesach, he set up the wall, or he designated the makom for the guy. So in this case, he already was a little bit over this or b'al yirah b'al yamatzeh, but he fixed it up somewhere in the interim. So what's the discussion we're going to discuss now? Is there a possibility to fix up your isser of b'al yirah b'al yamatzeh to the extent that we'll view it as if you didn't do any isser at all? And this is really based on a Tosfos which I didn't bring down because I don't think we need to sit inside because it's based on a sugya which is off topic. Tosfos Chav Tesam Beis Divrei HaMaskler of Ashi, that Tosfos over there says that, and if you remember from one of the previous shurim, we saw that the Gemara calls chametz, the Isser Vayir B'Matzeh, a lav hanitik b'aseh, a lav that can be fixed up with aseh of tashbisu. And so Tosfos says over there that therefore, as long as you destroyed your chametz before Pesach, you were never over the Isser Vayir B'Matzeh. Because the way he understands lav hanitik b'aseh, it seems at least in this situation, is that if I do the aseh, it wipes out the Isser. So therefore I had the chametz until a certain point, but then I fixed it up by destroying it, so I was never over the Isser. That's the Shita of Tosfos. The Rambam, as we saw in the previous year, he holds that chametz is not a lav hanitik b'aseh. He has some sort of different gears in the Gemara over there, as we pointed out, and therefore he holds that there is malchus. If a person has chametz on Pesach, and he did it with a maisa, where we spoke about that there was no maisa done, so there's no malchus, but he did it with a maisa, he made chametz on Pesach, or he bought chametz on Pesach, so he gets malchus, right? Because he can't fix it up by destroying the chametz. So those are two opinions. Can you fix up the Isser of V'hayira b'Yamatzeh by destroying it afterwards? According to Tosfos, you could. Shitas Ri in the Tosfos, and according to the Rambam, you can't. No, we don't have malchus nowadays. No. Okay, so the Shagas Aryeh wants to bring a proof for Shitas Tosfos, and it's from a Gemara in Beitza. The Mishnah, first Mishnah in the Masechta, and then the Gemara is later on Daf Zayin Amud Beis. So we'll first see the Mishnah, the little piece of the Mishnah that we need, which is Beishami or Beishamai says, Sa'ar b'kazayis, v'chametz b'kikoseves. The amount of Sa'ar, which is like a extremely fermented dough, which you can use to make other doughs, chametz, sourdough. So then that has a smaller shear. It's the shear of a kazayis. Chametz, which is just regular bread, has a larger shear of a koseves, which is the size of a date. The Beis Hillel and Beis Hillel says zev kazayis, that both of them are kazayis. The Gemara says, "My time to Beishamai." What's the reason for Beishamai? Im kain, because if so, lichtum rachmana chametz v'lo ba'isar. The Gemara should have just said that there's a chiyuv for chametz, and the Torah wouldn't have had to say that there's a chiyuv for sa'ar. V'ana amina, and I would have said umach chametz shein chimutzu kasha b'kazayis, chametz, which doesn't have such a strong fermentation. The chiyuv is with a shear of a kazayis. Sa'ar shachimutzu kasha lo kol shekain. Sa'ar, which is a much stronger chimutz, certainly there's an isser on a kazayis. Sa'ar to kaz rachmon alamali. So why does the pasuk need to say sa'ar? Lomer Lecha comes to teach us shiur shalzeh lo kishir shalzeh, that the shiurim are not the same. Right, so this Kal V'chomer is where our proof is going to come from, but we decided we could see the whole Gemara so that we have a better frame of reference of exactly what we're talking about. Beis Hillel says, Shrichi, we need both psukim. The ikaz v'rachmana sa'ar have aminu mishum dechimutz kasha. Had the pasuk only said sa'ar, I would have thought because it has a stronger chimutz. Aval chametz dechimutz kasha imolo, but chametz, which doesn't have such a strong chimutz, would not be chay. A person would not be chayav for tzricha. So that's why we need it to say chametz. Right, that Beishamai would agree to. Right, Beishamai is really saying the other direction, is what we're going to get to now. Because of Rachmana chametz, had the pasuk only said chametz, mishum deroi la'achila, because you could eat it. Aval sa'ar shem roi la'achila imalo. But sa'ar, the sourdough, you can't eat it, and therefore maybe you're not over an isser on Pesach. So therefore you need to say both of them. That's why we need both of them. Beishamai less luhud Rabbi Zera. So now the Gemara asked Beishamai, he doesn't hold like Rabbi Zera says. Dam Rabbi Zera says, Pasav chasav b'sa'ar b'sim b'chametz lomer cha zeu sa'ar zeu chametz. the Torah started with Sa'ar and concludes with Chametz in order to teach us that they're the same thing, that they have the same din, which seems to be, I think if I'm understanding correctly, it ends up being like the same svara as Beis Hillel, that the pasuk needs to tell us both of them. And so the Gemara explains, L'inyan achila kol yam lo pligi. The truth is, everyone agrees when it comes to eating. Ki pligi l'inyan beer, we're talking about destroying the chametz. Bishamei savri lo yalfina beer me'achila. Bishamei says you can't learn one from the other. And therefore, we wouldn't know that if we would learn one from the others, then we would understand that just like eating, the shear is a kazayis by both, so therefore destruction is a kazayis by both. We're not going to learn that way. We're going to stick with the way we understood before, that it didn't have to mention both chametz and sa'ar by destroying the chametz, and therefore we need it in order to teach us the two different shiurim. Beis Hillel says yalfinan biur me'achil. We learn biur from achil, and it's just like by biur, the chametz and the sa'ar are the same, so the same thing applies by the destruction of the chametz. So basically we have a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai about how much chametz you have to have in your house to be over the isser of bayra matzah. According to Beis Shammai, it's a different shear between the chametz and sa'ar. According to Beis Hillel, it's the same shear. Now the main thing we're taking out though from this Gemara is the kal v'chomer of Beis Shammai. And Beis Hillel seems to agree with the kal v'chomer, right? If it were really a kal v'chomer. He just is explaining why it's not a kal v'chomer. But Beis Shammai is saying, I didn't have to write sa'ar at all. Chametz would be good enough to teach me that sa'ar is, you'd be over the isser bayra matzah. Now, we hold that you can't learn a punishment, you can't learn an isser from a kal v'chomer. It's machlokes whether you can learn a punishment from a kal v'chomer, but you can't learn a new isser from a kal v'chomer. So therefore, even if we have a kal v'chomer, that chametz is a much lesser level of chimutz, let's say, and there's an isser of bayra matzah, that's not going to be able to give me an isser for sa'ar, because you can't learn a new isser from a kal v'chomer. Now this is specifically to a situation where there's malchus. That's the ein mazhir min adin. That's the lashon that we have in Maseches, I think it is Maseches Malchus, and we learn from there that you can't learn a new lav of malchus through a kal v'chomer, which it seems like Beis Shammai is saying he was willing to do. Now this is a question really on the Rambam, because the Rambam holds that there is malchus on the isser bayra matzah. So if there's malchus on isser bayra matzah, and it sounds like Beis Shammai is telling us that there's malchus on, and he's giving us the shear for malchus, and he was willing to learn it out from a kal v'chomer that sa'ar would get malchus, seems to be difficult. So the Shaggart explains that it's not a question on the Rambam, because the Rambam has an interesting rule, an interesting exception to this idea of ein onshim min adin, and we can see this from the Rambam in Hilchos Machalos Asuros, Perek Beis, Halacha Alpha Beis, which is the second Maramakom. It says, Miklal shenemer b'chol behimah represses parts which rosas shesa shtei prasos malagira. From the pasuk which says you have to eat an animal that has split hooves and chews its cud, shomea anisha kol she'ina malach gira represses parts asura. So I see from that pasuk that if it doesn't chew its cud, or it doesn't have split hooves, so then you can't eat it. V'lav habal micha aseh asehu. If the isser was only known because of this aseh, and there's a pasuk which was written in the positive form, right, eat this type of animal, so then it has the status of an aseh, you can't get malchus for such an isser. Uvegamal, uvechazir, uvarneves, uveshafan, by those four animals, remember the pasuk says, these animals you can't eat, even though they have either chewing their cud or splitting their hooves, since they don't have both. So we see that those animals have on them also a los esay, so there could be malchus, even though they have one siman. So certainly any other type of non-kosher animal, which doesn't have either of the simanim, So their isser of eating is also going to be a lav. Yes, or asay, more than just the asay. Habal michalus utochelu, which comes from the original pasuk we quoted, vosa tochelu. Lafikach, and therefore, kol ha'ochel mibasar behima v'chaya timeya kizayis. Anyone that eats from a non-kosher animal kizayis, loka min haTorah, he gets malchus. Bein she'achol min habasar, bein she'achol min ha'chelav. Doesn't matter what part of the animal he eats. There's no difference between the meat and the fat when it comes to a non-kosher animal. So we see here from the Rambam, he's willing to take a kal v'chomer and learn and give the person malchus for it. Now, let's say a person would eat a dog. Doesn't say anywhere in the Torah you can't eat a dog. We only know it, it's implied from the pasuk says you should eat animals that have split hooves and chew its cud, so I know that I can't eat the dog. That wouldn't give you malchus, that type of pasuk. He's learning it from the fact that the pasuk says, don't eat a pig, even though a pig has split hooves. Kal v'chomer, you can't eat a dog, which doesn't have anything. That's a kal v'chomer. How can you learn malchus from a kal v'chomer? So because of this, the Maggid Mishnah says, and I meant to copy the Gemara close, but I see that I forgot. So I'll just read it inside, and you'll have to listen. V'da she'in l'timo al masha amru shalav mine behema v'chaya temeyin ba kal v'chomer michazir shafam arneves, that don't wonder on the fact that the lav for other types of animals comes from a kal v'chomer. Mimasha kasav in mazhir midin kal v'chomer, for that which we know the rule is you can't learn a chi of malchus from a kal v'chomer. Lefisha elu kvar nesru b'lav haval michal asay min haTorah. These were already aser because of the lav haval michal asay. V'kevan shekin, and if that's true, after l'lav shehin shalahan lavo mikal v'chomer, you can have the lav come from a kal v'chomer. So therefore, Maggid Mishnah is teaching us a new detail to this rule that I cannot create a lav with malchus from a kal v'chomer. That's only if there was never an isser. I can't create a whole new isser that didn't exist at all and give malchus for it because of a kal v'chomer. But if it was aser because of a isser asay, right, here we already knew you couldn't eat the dog, there just was no lav to give malchus for, but we knew it was aser without the kal v'chomer, so then the kal v'chomer could add the chomer of making it a los asay to get malchus. That's the rule of the Maggid Mishnah. Now, how would that apply in our case of chametz? All chametz, whether it's sa'ar or chametz, you already have to get rid of it, an asay, a mitzvah asay of tashbisu, already from Erev Pesach, as we spoke about before. And there it says explicitly, tashbisu sa'ar. You have to get rid of the sa'ar. So I know that I'm not allowed to have sa'ar on Pesach. Right? That I already know. All we're doing with the kal v'chomer from chametz, according to Beis Shammai, would be to add the level to make it a lav with malchus. That you're allowed to do with the kal v'chomer, according to the Rambam. Now, does Tosos hold of this rule? So, the Shagat wants to prove that Tosos does not hold this rule from the Gemara Pesachim Daf Aleph and the Tosos over there, Divrei Maskal Ika. And the Gemara says, we're talking about cooking a Korban Pesach. Korban Pesach can't be cooked, it has to be roasted. And the Brisa says, Tanar Rabbanim, b'mayim, the Pasuk says you can't cook it in water. Eili al b'mayim, I only know water. Shar mashki minayin, how do I know you can't cook it with any other liquid? Amarta, kal v'chomer, it's a kal v'chomer. Mayim, shein mafigin taimon asurin. Water, which doesn't really affect the taste of the meat so much, is going to make is usher to do to the Korban Pesach, and it's a chiv lav with malchus to cook it in water. Shar mashkin shemafigin taimon lo kol shekin. So other liquids which do change the taste even more, certainly there's a lav. Right, now here again, it's a kal v'chomer to teach me malchus. According to the Rambam, not a problem, because we know the pasuk says you have to roast it. So I know if I'm doing anything besides roasting, I'm already doing something asar. I'm just here adding on that if I cook it in grape juice, so there's also a lav with malchus. I'm allowed to do that with a kal v'chomer, according to the Rambam. What does Tosos say on this Gemara? Tosos says, V'im tomar, V'hechi yolif shar mashkin mi kal v'chomer. How can you learn from a kal v'chomer? V'ha'in mazhir min adin. You can't give malchus, a lav with malchus from a kal v'chomer. V'yishlomer, the answer is the high kal v'chomer eno el megala the bishul dekra ayri apishar mashkin. The kal v'chomer is just to show us that when the pasuk says cooking, it means also other liquids. So we're not actually learning a real kal v'chomer. Right? This type of logic we find in the Rishonim sometimes. It's a little bit hard to pinpoint exactly what the point is, but it's not using the rules of a kal v'chomer. It's using the logic of a kal v'chomer just to explain what the pasuk is saying explicitly. And therefore, it's not I'm learning a lav from a kal v'chomer. I'm learning a lav from the pasuk, and it's just we're using this type of logic in order to explain what the pasuk means. But the main point is that Tosfos isn't saying like what we explained in the Rambam, which is that I'm allowed to learn a kal v'chomer if I already have an isser, just to bump it up to a lo saseh with kares. He doesn't say that. So you see that Tosfos doesn't seem to hold of this rule of the Rambam. However, the Shagas Aryeh asks that even according to Tosfos, that holds that Bal Yorah and Bal Yamatzeh is a lav hanitik baseh, means that I fix it up by doing the mitzvah of tashbisu, that I'm no longer over the Isser of Bal Yorah Bal Yamatzeh, and therefore there's no malchus. That doesn't mean that it's a lav that doesn't have malchus. If he fixes it up, there's no malchus. If he doesn't fix it up, there would be malchus. For example, right, he has the chametz on Pesach, and he doesn't destroy it. And he leaves it throughout the entire week of Pesach, and after Pesach he sells the chametz. You can't do the mitzvah of tashbisu anymore. This is tashbisu is only when there's still an Isser of chametz still going on. On Pesach you could do tashbisu. So since he can't do the mitzvah anymore, so then he was over the Isser, and he would get malchus. The truth is this is subject to machlokus. Some say that I have to actually do something to make it that I can't do the mitzvah in order to get malchus for the Isser. According to that shita, there's really no question. But there is another shita, and it's a whole complicated machlokus in Maseches Makos, and if you're familiar with the wording, over there we have the concept of bitlo v'lo bitlo, which is a shita of Rabbi Yochanan, or the concept of kimu v'lo kimu, which is a shita of Reish Lakish, which means kimu v'lo kimu, if he didn't fulfill the aseh, even if he didn't do anything special to make him not himself not be able to fulfill that aseh, he just didn't do it, he gets the malchus. That's what Reish Lakish would say. So according to that shita, it would come out that the Isser of Bal Yorah Bal Yamatzeh is an Isser that gets malchus. You could get out of the malchus by doing the mitzvah of tashbisu, but at some point, if he didn't do the mitzvah, he's going to get malchus. Therefore, we're still stuck with our issue within Beis Shammai. How can Beis Shammai learn a kal v'chomer from chametz to seor to give malchus, to create an Isser which has malchus? There is a situation where it has malchus. And we say, Ein Mazhir Min Adin. So we explain, according to the sheet of the Rambam, his svara, not a problem, because it already was Aser. It just didn't have the lav. So the lav I could put on with the kal v'chomer. We explained, we showed Araya, Tosfos doesn't hold of that. If you don't hold of that, so then you're stuck with a question. And this question the Shagas Aryeh doesn't have an answer to. He leaves this off as a question against the shita of Tosfos, within how to understand Ein Mazhir Min Adin. That's really kind of a side point. Getting back to fixing up the Isser of Bal Yorah and Bal Yamatzeh, there's actually a third approach. Right? We saw the approach of Tosfos, which is you do the mitzvah and then your Isser gets erased. We saw the opinion of the Rambam, which is there is no such thing as erasing the Isser of Bal Yorah and Bal Yamatzeh. It's two separate things. There's the mitzvah of destroying your chametz, and the Isser. The mitzvah is not connected to the Isser. There's a shita of Rashi who does hold, like the way we have the Gersa and the Gemara, that Bal Yorah and Bal Yamatzeh is a lav hanitik laseh. That means that Aseh Tashbisu does fix up your Isser of Bal Yorah Bal Yamatzeh. However, he understands how does it fix up completely different than the way Tosfos understands. He doesn't understand that when you do the mitzvah, it then erases the Isser that you did. It's just enough that you won't get punished for it with malchus. So therefore, he had chametz, let's say, the first couple days of Pesach, and then he destroys it. So he can't erase the fact that he had chametz in his house for the first 2 days of Pesach, he was over an Isser. It's just since he took care of it eventually, Beis is not going to give him malchus, but he has the Isser. That's the shita of Rashi. And that we see in V'sachim Daf Vavam Beis, which is the fourth Maramakom, that says over there, Amar Rava, Gezir Shamim Suguska Yafa V'dai Televe. The reason why we get rid of our chametz is maybe you'll find a nice piece of chametz and you'll have das on it. Rashi explains, what does it mean you'll have das on it? Chashuvi hi be'inav, it'll be something which is chashuv, v'chas alei l'sarfa, and he won't want to burn it. U'misha afilu rega echad, he'll leave it without burning it even for one moment. V'nimsa over alei v'ayir abayim matzeh, will be over this or v'ayir abayim matzeh. So what do you mean even for a minute? According to Tosfos, I have all Pesach. As long as I eventually burn it, then we'll be over this or. So we see that Rashi doesn't hold that way. If I'm over for a minute, then I'm over this or. There's nothing you do after that is going to take that away. So now getting back to our question, I had the chametz of the guy on Pesach, and I didn't make the wall, and I didn't set aside a makom, so I was over the isser of Ba'ira Ba'y Matzeh on Pesach. And then in the middle of Pesach, I did what I was supposed to do. I put the wall, and I designated a spot for the guy, and then from now on, I'm not over this with Ba'y Matzeh. The question is, what about the Ba'ira Ba'y Matzeh that I was over up until the point where I made the tikkun? We're going to assume if I was over this or up until that point, so then after Pesach, the chametz is going to be aser because it's a kanas for being over the isser. I was over the isser. But if I somehow could take away that isser, so then the chametz could be mutter after Pesach. So according to the Rambam, there's nothing to talk about because the isser is never taken away by the mitzvah of tashbisu, of getting rid of your chametz. So therefore, the isser that he was over. Nothing to talk about according to the Rambam, and therefore the chametz is going to be aser after Pesach. Also according to Rashi, the mitzvah of getting rid of your chametz will take care of the fact you won't get malchus for the Ba'ir Ba'y Matzeh, but the Isser Ba'ir Ba'y Matzeh was still over, and therefore it's shaykh to have the kanas, and after Pesach this chametz will be aser. Tosfos, there's what to talk about, because according to Tosfos, as long as I take care of the issue on Pesach, so that it erases the Isser that I did, so if I didn't do any Isser, so the chametz would not be aser after Pesach. However, the Shagasari says, in this case, even Tosfos would agree that this chametz is going to be also after Pesach. And why is that? Because he said you never really did the asay of tashbisu. But you have the lav of Ba'ir Ba'y Matzeh. The asay of tashbisu erases that lav. But here he didn't destroy the chametz. He just removed it from his reshus. And as the Gemara says, in Psachim Davav, which is where we see this tikkun of removing it from his reshus, says yichid lo bayis, if you designated an area or a room for the guy, ein zachuk levar, you don't have to get rid of it. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, lo yimtzav v'teichem, it shouldn't be found in your house. V'halav didehu, and it's not yours. The nachri ki kamayil levisa nafshi kamayil, and the guy of the nachri is brought into the nachri's own house. So why is he not over this, or if he does this? Not because it's considered like he did the mitzvah of tashbisu. It's just it doesn't fit anymore into the pasuk of Vatechem. So even according to Tosfos, the chametz of the guy that I had on Pesach, and then I designated him a spot on Pesach, and I'm not over this or from now on, that for sure that was not going to annul the Isser that I was over up until this point. Only the mitzvah of tashbisu, of destroying chametz, can possibly annul the Isser. Right? That's the idea of the lav hanetik baseh, that an Isser can be, according to Tosfos, completely fixed up by doing the mitzvah which is attached to it. But here he's not doing the mitzvah. He's just doing a technicality so he won't be over the Isser from now on. But it's not going to fix up the Isser he already did. So therefore, Shagasari points out that according to all Shitas, if he was over the Isser Ba'ir Ba'y Matzeh, and then just did this tikkun of setting aside the place for the guy on Pesach, it's not going to help him to be able to have enough of this Pesach, from this chametz after Pesach. So